Okay, folks, we'll get going in about a minute or two. All right, my clock says 7:02, so I think we're going to go ahead and get going. We like to respect people's time and kind of stick to our schedule. So you see here the topic I'm going to talk about tonight, just so you know you're in the right place. I am Dave Sly, the Water Quality Program Director for Wild Virginia. And we have a fairly extensive PFAS campaign. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some aspects of that tonight. And first, though, I want to give you some details about what's happening here. This program is being recorded, and that will be available later on to you folks and anybody else who registered. If you would like, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, say, where you're coming from or whatever you'd like to say. That kind of gets the community talking to each other. At the same time, if you have questions during the program, feel free to put those in the Q&A box. Won't try to address them during the talk, but we'll get to those at the end, as many as we can. And then finally, you will get a follow-up email that includes the link to the recording and some other kinds of information that hopefully will be useful to you. And again, absolutely share with other folks who might be interested who couldn't be here. So we want to spread it as widely as possible. Now I have to give my little advertisement for Wild Virginia. We have more programs other than PFAS. We have a very important habitat connectivity program. Actually, getting ready to get on board our new director of that program. While Virginia's been a leader in that area for quite some time, and so that's really important. Water quality programs include PFAS, but it also includes a lot of other threats to water quality and ways that we can strengthen our regulations and the way that they are enforced. We've been very much involved in pipelines, first the Atlantic Coast and Mountain Valley pipelines, but are still fighting the MVP Southgate and the Southeast Supply Enhancement Pipeline. So if you're interested in that aspect, please follow us. We have a fairly new program. We're now in our third year of our Clean Water Advocates program, where we train people through a couple of months of online courses on how the Clean Water Act works, how different regulations and protections are supposed to be applied. And they're going to give people kind of practical tools as to how they can be effective advocates on their own right. And then finally, we have lots of other webinars like this. Um, so it's not just any one subject. We have lots of great guest speakers. So follow us and pay attention to those things. And then finally, we depend on your support. Obviously, that can be through membership donations, but it can also just be through the fact that you follow us. And when we ask people to make comments or to chime in on issues, you give us strength by joining your voice with ours. One thing that I didn't do right up front is to acknowledge my colleagues from Wild Virginia, Kylie and Lauren, who are trying to keep me on track here, very valuable parts of the team. And they have to listen to me all the time, so you can sympathize with them. So let's jump right in. Again, The subject is PFAS. We are focusing very heavily on a really significant event that happened this year, and that was that the state issued a fish consumption advisory in the Chickahominy River watershed. But I also want to talk about kind of the context around that, how that happened, what kind of data we have on not only in the Chickahominy, but across the state, and then some other steps that really need to be taken to address these threats. Having the consumption advisory is important, but there are really more important things in some ways that can give us the chance to solve some of these problems instead of just acknowledging them. Um, so, with that, I always like to try to start with a little bit of explanation of PFAS if you're brand new to it. Um, obviously, I'm not going to get into great detail, but just in case you don't know, there really are thousands of forms of these substances. The technical name is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And there, I think you see different estimates, but certainly probably more than 10,000 separate types. And we are still just learning more and more about these things quickly as we go forward. They have been around a while since the 40s when we started coming up with lots of new project products and not lots of new things that, you know, that we valued. Nonstick cookware, um, weather-resistant clothing, all those kinds of things that we've come to rely on. But for a long time, we didn't realize what we were putting into the environment, into our bodies, into wildlife. And so it's important that we now face those realities and figure out how best to deal with them. Um, the fact that these PFAS, these forms of PFAS, last very long time, that's why we call them forever chemicals, is they do not break down easily. Again, in the environment, in our bodies, in a water body. And so they accumulate, they concentrate, and they build up over time. Unlike some pollutants, which in some cases they'll get into the environment and then they will cycle through and they're gone. But you can't count on PFAS to do that. So if you find sources and if you find contamination, say in a stream, um, you can expect that whatever's in the fish today might climb through the next, months and years. So you have to be concerned about that as an ongoing problem. I've given here an example of one kind of concentration, which is a very low concentration, 4 nanograms per liter. That's parts per trillion. A part per trillion is, I think I've seen the estimate that it's like one drop in a couple of Olympic-sized swimming pools. So you can just envision how teeny tiny that is. And the fact is that this number, which is considered a Safe Drinking Water Act, number that EPA has up with, there are concentrations even much, much lower than that that are probably of great concern. Um, and again, not only do they stick around, but they can cause really, really, or are related to really, really serious health effects. EPA says that at least two kinds of PFAS are likely carcinogens. Other countries and other places have made that assertion even stronger. But just a range of problems that can pop up, over time. And in some cases, it's going to be hard to even tie them back to the source. We are finding them increasingly around Virginia. Frankly, when you look in stream water, in sediments, in fish or other organisms, uh, we find them pretty widely. We're also, because more of the water sources around Virginia, whether it be a groundwater drinking water supply or a surface water, they are finding it much more widely. And so it's just something we have to deal with, we have to take very seriously. I listed here some of the forms that people may have heard about, but again, there's so many. And not only don't we know enough about the individual ones, we don't know enough about how a combination of 2 or 10 or 50 of those substances might have. Um, but I'll say that one of Wild Virginia's focuses has been from the start that since this is such a huge topic, we really focus in on where we think there's authority and duty right now for our regulators, for our government representatives to do certain things to stop more of these substances from getting into the environment. We won't solve all the problems immediately, but we can take actions on those right away. And that's what we insist on, and that's what we invite you to join us in that effort. But as I say, I did want to start with this fish consumption advisory in the Chickahominy River watershed. Um, the health department came out with that a while back, and as you can see, it got some coverage. But I will say that we thought it was really important for us to also kind of amplify that news, both for anybody who uses those water bodies, but for anybody who cares about this issue more widely. Because as I say, the fact that we have found high levels and real threats in the Chickahominy, we are almost certain to find those in other areas. In fact, we have found them in other areas. And so it's good for people to know the process, to know the different mechanisms through which we can get the word out there about these problems and then try to solve them. So again, the health department came out with this thing they call a fish consumption advisory in May of this year. And it deals specifically with the Chickahominy River and one of its main tributaries, White Oak Swamp. These flowed from the Richmond area down towards to the southeast. And of course, the Chickahominy flows into the James River. Um, The fish consumption advisory that the health department has issued deals with only that one form of PFAS, which is called PFOS, or at least that's the way I pronounce it. It's again one of those sources or one of those forms that is found much more widely than some others. Um, the advisory does cover specifically certain kinds of fish and certain areas. So this is directly out of the health department's website where it defines, what area we're covering, and what fish you have to be concerned with. And so you see there, if you're in the White Oak Swamp area, whoops, well, I can stay here for a minute. Those, maybe I can. The areas that are in yellow there, that's the White Oak Swamp area. And essentially, what that warning is telling you is don't eat these kinds of fish, the chub sucker, the pickerel, the sunfish, if you catch them in those areas. For the others in the Chickahominy, there's a limit or a recommended limit on how much or how often you eat those fish. And when we talk about, no more than a certain number of meals, we're talking a meal, I think, is considered 8 ounces of fish, which is not a lot. So anyway, that's the way that the advisory is set up. And as I say, those are the areas that are covered. Um, and if you look at the health department's website, I just grabbed all these quotes directly from their website just to give you an idea of how they characterize what a consumption advisory is and what you should think about it. They are not, a ban on anybody going and fishing in those areas, catching those fish, and they honestly can't tell you not to eat those fish. They're just giving you a warning so that you can be educated and make your own choices. But it's a pretty big deal, frankly. If you look on the health department's website, you'll find that there aren't there aren't that many fish consumption advisories for any of the many, many dangerous chemicals, everything from PCBs to heavy metals. There are spread around the state, but it is a pretty kind of weighty decision for the state to make that designation. Um, so I think it's important, this one thing, this statement here, that the numbers, like for example, where I showed that no more than a couple of meals per month, I guess it is, that's to protect kind of the average person who might be eating fish. But they've also made the point that if, there are people who are pregnant, nursing young children, that they probably shouldn't eat any of the fish in those areas. So, really public health protections should be geared to the most sensitive people, the people who have the most likelihood of having a problem. So that's really important to note. So how did we get to this place with this fish consumption advisory? What got us here? The thing is that the Newport News Waterworks found some PFAS in their drinking water supply and came to DEQ and others and said, there's a concern here. We have to figure this out. And to their credit, to the credit of DEQ, the health department, Henrico County, and others, they got together and started doing some fairly intensive sampling in that Chickahominy River area. Um, because of course that water intake draws out of the Chickahominy. Um, that study was really the most intensive one we've had for fish, water, so on in the state, and the most kind of concentrated in a particular area. Um, the U.S. Geological Service was contracted to do quite a bit of the monitoring. And again, it's fish, but also the water itself and sediments within those water bodies. And when they were first going through this analysis, the DEQ and VDH created what they call a story map. And these images, both the last slide and this one, come from that source. So on the information has been online since December of 2022. And it was kind of striking when I first found a couple of years ago that DEQ and the health department had made this kind of warning that you see right here. Um, that at that time, based on what they knew and what they considered to be reasonable screening levels, they were saying from that very early time that they recommended that kids and pregnant women not eat fish from those areas. So we had a really serious kind of judgment from then early on. It's unfortunate that it took as long as it did for that to become a solid fish consumption advisory that was then kind of distributed and made official. But from that point forward, anybody who was paying attention, who valued, the advice from these agencies whom we should be able to rely on, their use of those water bodies was, if they wanted to pay attention, was affected. And one of the principles of the Clean Water Act, of state water law, is that we have a right to use our water bodies. We have what are called designated uses, which include things like recreation. They include being able to catch and eat fish and shellfish, um, you know, drink water from streams. Those uses are supposed to be protected. And whenever there's a condition created that would interfere with those uses, that's considered a problem. That's considered a violation essentially under the Clean Water Act. So we feel that as soon as the health department and DEQ felt it necessary to make this warning way back there, that was a very serious step. And we have pushed ever since then for other steps to be taken. Um, the other part of this is that while there is that pretty good body of data on the Chickahominy area, again, some of those same parties, the Health Department, USGS, DEQ, have done much more monitoring. And again, we give credit for that. It's pretty widely spread. We need to do even more. But there's a lot of data. As you can see here, we did spend a lot of time compiling and sorting and looking at all that data, nearly 39,000 pieces altogether, in the form of, specific sites, specific samples, sometimes on one date at a site, sometimes multiple times at the same place. Um, and they're usually looking at a kind of a certain set of PFAS. Out of those thousands, there is kind of an acceptable smaller subset that at least people want to start with when they're taking samples and doing monitoring. And I think I said before that those samples do include um, from surface water, streams, wetlands, from the fish tissue, and from the sediments. I'll say the probably about 2/3 of the total are from surface water and about a third from fish tissue. So, excuse me, the sediments is a fairly small percentage. And I'm not going to throw lots and lots of data from all those assessments at you, but I think there are just some simple findings that are really significant and frankly a little bit shocking. Um, of the data of the places where fish tissue was sampled, which, excuse me, by our count of the all the data we downloaded from DEQ, there was 108 sites where fish were measured or fish tissue was measured. I'm sorry. Um, and 63 of those had reportable levels of PFAS. Really sorry, I've had a cough in recent days and I thought it was gone, but it's trying to come back on me. But anyway, you can see that, that's pretty close to 60% of all the sites where they did sample fish had amounts of PFAS that you could measure. And again, that's just one form of the total set of PFAS. I could throw a lot more numbers for different forms, but that's probably one of the most significant. And the fact that that's the one that was addressed through the fish consumption advisory means it really makes sense to kind of focus in on that. And I'll note that certainly the numbers in the Chickahominy Basin or watershed were the highest overall, but there were some very significant numbers in other places as well. Um, there are reportable amounts from around the state. And that's why I think that whether you pay close attention or use the Chickahominy area or not, hopefully this is of interest and use to you. One thing that is important, and part of the reason that I always note which places have reportable amounts of these substances instead of necessarily how much, they exceed certain thresholds, is that, as I said before, some of these forms, including PFOS and PFOA, are considered likely carcinogens. And one thing that people don't always recognize is that scientists have said for generations that for carcinogens, there's really no safe level. We are told many times that, oh, this much is okay, um, it's safe. But that's not really the understanding of most scientists. Um, from a very, very small amount, you start to gain a certain amount of risk when you're exposed to those things. So again, we say in this context that it's important to report wherever these things are showing up. It's also important where we have the chance, and I'll talk to it a little bit more, where we have the chance to apply regulations, that we take that that issue seriously, that we're not just trying to meet some kind of arbitrary minimum, or maximum rather, that we are acknowledging the fact that these things shouldn't be in our waters at all. And to the extent that we can exclude them from going into the water, onto the land, into our drinking water, we should do that and not just fall back on the idea that, oh, there's some acceptable level. The goal should be eliminating them. Um, the surface water data, again, there were many thousands of pieces of data, 151 sites around the state. And again, that really it gets into pretty much every river basin area, many smaller watersheds. And of those, oh no, I said there were 150 measured. There were many more, but 151 sites where there were detectable levels of PFAS. There was similar numbers for PFOA. And then I'll say that when you look at the set of compounds that were measured in any specific sample, you could also just add up the different forms. There may have been 10 or 20 or more of those individual types of PFAS that were measured. And so that total number is also really significant. And that's just another part of this equation that we really haven't looked at in enough detail and understood. Um, but at these places, including the Chickahominy, but some others, we do have concentrations that are frankly enormous. Um, I mentioned previously, or one of the slides said something about the 4 parts per trillion of PFOS as a drinking water limit or a drinking water standard. But EPA has come up with numbers that they feel are truly more protective of when they're in the streams, of preventing more threat for people who are eating fish, shellfish, or drinking water. And those are much lower than the 4 parts per trillion. And so quite a few of the places that have been measured around the state of these 150 some sites where we found PFOS, they can be hundreds or thousands of times what EPA has come up with as a real concern. So it, I could get into real depth on this data, and I'll tell you I'm a nerd, so I love to do that. But I don't think that's the most useful thing here. And again, I'll point out I just picked out PFOS here. I could have picked out probably half a dozen and shown you some really significant things. Um, but I think this gets the message across. So we've got the fish consumption advisory. Frankly, it took way too long for that to happen. We supported the fact that it was being proposed, um, you know, but that's just a very partial step in trying to both let the public know what's going on and solve the problems. As the statement from the health department site says, these are not prohibitions, they're not some regulatory requirement, they're just a warning. Um, what we do have under the Clean Water Act and under state law are some regulatory structures that we really need to pay attention to. And those are under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. And unfortunately, so far we've had very little success in getting the DEQ to live up to some of these other responsibilities they have. So while we have the fish consumption advisory, there's another mechanism under the Clean Water Act, where states are supposed to assess all the water quality data in their areas. And then they're supposed to name places where we have violations of water standards, where there are problematic amounts of pollution. And then the other thing that the states have to do is to control discharges or releases to the environment. They can include discharges from wastewater plants, from runoff, from all kinds of sources. Can also include land application of things like sewage sludge. So in both of those areas, there's some very strong authority for the state and frankly the EPA to kind of step up their game here. We shouldn't just have a warning sitting out there from the health department and just accept that as the last step. Now, when it comes to that assessment and the assembly or the creation of the impaired water bodies list, that's something again that's mandated under the Clean Water Act. It's something that Virginia does every 2 years. Its most recent assessment was from last year, 2024. Um, and they call it the integrated report because it really technically has two pieces. The first is, as it says here, that they're supposed to assemble and evaluate all existing and readily available water quality data and information. They're supposed to get it together and they're supposed to analyze it, to tell us what it means, to tell Congress, to tell the federal government what it means. Part of that is, does it meet our water quality standards? Does it protect those kinds of designated uses, our recreation, our drinking water, as it's supposed to? And if it doesn't, then they're supposed to take the next step, which is to designate the affected waters as impaired. Now, that may sound like kind of like a fish consumption advisory, just putting a name on something, but it is way more than that. The thing is that that impairment designation carries or sets off a string of other actions that then the state and other parties are required to take. Because once you've identified water quality standards violations, you're supposed to put into action some pretty serious steps to solve them. Um, that includes the kind of permitting systems I'm going to talk about in a minute, but it really is a powerful tool, frankly. Nobody wants their water body to be designated as impaired or polluted. But when it is, it's important to acknowledge it, and it's important to make that part of the regulatory system. Um, so when DEQ came out with its draft 2022 integrated report, which again was supposed to be that assessment and that designation list, they did not address PFAS in any serious way, which we found fairly shocking. All that data, all those many thousands of pieces of information that I cited before, DEQ really didn't mention all that data. They didn't talk about the fact that the Chickahominy had horrible levels in their fish and in their water. They didn't talk about the fact that these chemicals were widespread. And um, they did not suggest or try to designate any water bodies for water quality standards violations um, as being impaired. So when we responded to that the draft integrated report back in, I think, May of 2024, we called out, those deficiencies and spelled out because we went and got the data. It wasn't just that those data were available to them. We said it's there, it's sitting in your lap, you have to use it. Um, and so we have advocated that not only some of those areas in the Chickahominy watershed be designated, but they must take a serious look at some of those other streams and water bodies around the state. Because it's not just the fish tissue numbers, it's not any one specific part of the contamination that they're supposed to look at. Um, the other thing is that while DEQ has the primary responsibility for this kind of action under the Clean Water Act and under our own laws, EPA has an oversight role of DEQ in this process. Um, and we have also been advocating with EPA that they need to tell DEQ you've got to do it right. And if you don't do it right, then they have a responsibility, they being EPA, to get that fixed. And so that's just one thing that we're in the midst of right now. We're advocating basically that the duties of those agencies be carried out, and we'll continue to do that. Um, another part of the whole regulatory system, as I said before, you've got a lot of places that are discharging wastewater and stormwater that carries pollutants in it into our streams and into our reservoirs and the Chesapeake Bay eventually, for many of them. If you discharge pollutants into our waters, you have to have a permit, and those permits have to require kind of monitoring and limitations on how much of those things are going to affect our water quality. Um, and that is in effect anytime you know there's are specific pollutants there, or if you even have a serious likelihood that they're going to be there. We and others have been commenting to DEQ for more than 2 years now about the need for these permits to include the correct types of requirements. And as I said here, DEQ has not only failed to do so, they've refused to do so. And that's just, it's both baffling and a little bit greatly discouraging, I will say, that they have avoided doing those actions. Um, One of the parts of us figuring out the extent of the problem is also to look at those releases to the environment. We can do all the monitoring that we want in the fish and in the streams, but we need to know where it's coming from. Um, and that can help us know where to apply um, solutions. Um, so that's, again, I wanted people to understand that Chickahominy situation, but I also wanted to give people kind of the background and the context that really goes a lot beyond that specific area. Certainly that in itself is important enough to talk about because it's a very serious health threat. But at the same time, we need to understand that it's far from limited to those kinds of places. And although I just barely touched on those two regulatory areas in which we're working, if you follow us, if you get our emails, we pretty regularly put out alerts and say, hey, this situation is going on, this permit is being proposed, and there's a problem. There's PFAS in this discharge and it needs to be controlled. And so, we need all the voices we can get. As I say, so far we've not convinced the DEQ to do the right thing in this context. And we'll keep going, but we definitely invite you to join us in that effort. Um, so part of that is going to virginia.org, getting on our mailing list, joining us. Of course, you might be interested in all those other cool programs we have going on. And we want you. We want you to be a wild Virginian. Um, so with that, I'm going to see if Lauren can help me figure out some questions that I need to answer.
Yeah, so we just have one question so far. Someone asked, has DEQ designated any water body as impaired for PFAS yet?
It has not. And again, obviously, we feel that Chickahominy, both White Oak Swamp and the Chickahominy River itself, more than qualify for that designation. And so that's been kind of as it has been here tonight, that's been kind of our central focus and message to DEQ and to EPA. But we've also pointed out that, as I said, the widespread data shows that that's far from an isolated case. It might be the worst case, but it's not in any way isolated. Um, so, we can just continue to advocate for that. I'll tell you some details about the Chickahominy that I really didn't get into, but if I have a little time. It was not only the fish tissue problem that we saw there, but for example, there's a section of the Chickahominy River just upstream of that Newport News water intake where people's drinking water is being taken out of the river. And that section, it's a 5 mile segment. There are actually measurements in that part of the stream where the PFOA exceed the drinking water standards that EPA has set out. So that explicitly is a problem, an interference with a denial of a safe designated use. The other thing that the point that we made, and I kind of got at it earlier, is that when you look at that statement that the health department and DEQ made all the way back there in 2022, to us, that in itself was an admission that these waters are impaired. Because again, um, I will say that if I get a warning that I shouldn't be, going to, or that members of my family, people that I care about, shouldn't be eating fish from this area, I'm going to take it seriously. And that's a violation, frankly, of our rights. We have the right to be able to use these water bodies. We have the right to have them protected. So yeah, unfortunately, it is the case that there haven't been more impairments. I'm going to stop sharing here. Let's see. Do you see any other questions that I can get
Yeah,
at?
we have about 8 questions lined up. So the next question is, what is DEQ doing about PFAS contamination in groundwater?
Really, the only thing that is, well, the most active thing is that under a piece of legislation that came out in 2024, the health department and DEQ were supposed to look at data from a wide range of water supplies, and that includes both water use that comes out of streams, but also that comes from groundwater. And what they have found is that there are quite a few of those public water supplies that take from the groundwater that use wells where they have very significant amounts of PFAS. And so that is yet another process, and that's a good thing. That has set in motion the possibility that they'll start looking around those sites at the groundwater, what's affecting the groundwater there. I'll say there's another initiative that we supported last year in the legislature, and that was what we thought was a really great proposal from both a senator and a delegate. That was to give people the power to get money and help to sample their own private water wells, because there are many, many millions of people around, or many hundreds of thousands of people around the state who drink from private wells, and so they're not covered by these public systems. And it got wide support in the legislature, but then when it came to an appropriation of money to support it, the bill died. So if you're interested in groundwater and specifically protecting private wells, keep an eye out because that might well come up again this year.
Great. Our next question is, can you refer us to a site where we can check PFAS levels in our local rivers?
I can indeed. And in fact, I think I named it earlier. There's something called the DQ calls its dashboard. It's PFAS dashboard. And what you can do is you can go on there and it has a map that you can zero in on specific areas. to get data. You can download data and sort it in different ways. So it's a pretty good source. And so we'll include links to that in the follow-up email that we'll give you.
Okay. And then our next question is Henrico County advocating for DEQ to do the right thing? If not, why not?
Um, I have not seen any specific action or specific statements from Henrico County in regard to that. So I won't say that they've not advocated, but I don't know of any advocacy on their part. Um, and whether they are or not, I don't have any rationale for their choice. I will say that in every case where we have addressed specific permits, especially for those kinds of municipal wastewater authorities, in many cases we've gone to those folks and said, hey, no matter what DEQ does, you can take action. You have a responsibility. For example, we did that with a large wastewater plant in Roanoke, with the folks who run a wastewater plant here in the Ravenna River area. Um, and so what we're telling those folks is don't even wait for DEQ to require you to do things that make sense because the monitoring and the limitations and solving the problems, it's never going to get easier and it's never going to get cheaper from this day forward. And it is inevitable that you're going to have to deal with some of these things. So we just encourage, and I will say one more thing is that the municipalities, the people who get wastewater coming into their plants, they didn't create these problems. They get waste from industries and homes and businesses, and they have to deal with it. So we sympathize with that. But at the same time, we got to set these solutions in motion.
Great. And just a heads up, we do have about 10 more open questions
Oh,
in the chat.
okay.
And the next question is, when PFAS are identified in a particular body of water, what is the possibility of tracing the sources? Also, what can be done about this contamination other than posting fish consumption advisories?
Well, tracing, sometimes it can be relatively easy, but it could be complicated also because there could be multiple sources. I will say that we've seen quite a bit of data down there in the White Oak area and the upper Chickahominy River area for the Richmond Airport. And they have, again, to their credit, been doing quite a bit of monitoring of their stormwater coming off the site. And there's significant amounts of PFAS there. So that was one obvious source. I won't say that's the only source of the contamination in the Chickahominy watershed, but it is a source, and it was possible to find that in part because we know certain kinds of activities produce PFAS. For example, airports and some other places where they've had to have firefighting equipment and foam, which is a significant source of PFAS. Through the years, airports and other facilities had to use that foam. They were required legally to do it, both when they had fires and when they were doing training activities. So um, we also know that certain industries are more likely to have PFAS than not. And finally, some people are out there sampling their own discharges. Again, even though DEQ hasn't required it, some people have been responsible and have started to do that. So it can be complicated, but it is possible to do a reasonable kind of re, reconnaissance, I guess you might call it, to figure out the sources. And I think just as far as what can be done other than the consumption advisories, as I say, we've got to start that regulatory part of it. It's fine to warn people, but we've got to use those tools that have some teeth that can then set in place, actual requirements to solve these things. What else you got?
All right, the next question is, can local governments require additional testing of biosolids before they are spread? And would that information be public?
Well, yes, to both. You know, the people who own the wastewater, municipal wastewater plant, have a lot of control as to what comes, or as to monitoring and analysis of what comes into their plant and what goes out of their plant. They do sample that sludge or biosolids for a number of things. There is absolutely no reason they can't and shouldn't be measuring it for PFAS, because there again we know that probably it is so predictable that municipal wastewater sludge will have PFAS that it's probably safer to say, that they will all have it than not. Um, the other part of that, as I say, is the water coming into their plants. Municipalities also have this thing called a pretreatment program, where they then become the regulator of the significant industries who feed water to them. And that's yet another place where they themselves have some authority that we'd like to see them step up. Okay.
Next question is, any theories on why DEQ is so resistant to do anything with their data? And then a follow-up question to that is, what types of assays are used to detect such small concentrations of PFAS?
I'm always hesitant to try to ascribe motives to an agency or to an individual. What they tell us is that we're doing some other things. We're doing that program like I described for drinking water, where they're looking at some of those selected sites. And EPA is not making us do these other things. But those are not valid answers. Those are not acceptable answers. So they are not giving us any rationale that we think is acceptable. I will simply say that. One of the things they are telling us is that we don't have water quality standards that address PFAS, and that is simply not true. What they can validly say is we don't have numeric water quality criteria that we can easily apply, but that does not get them off the hook of using their water quality standards in the way that the law requires.
Great. Next question is, how did the Chickahominy get on the radar?
Well, again, as it said in that story map that all those folks put together, I believe it was because the folks at the Newport News drinking water supply found some in their water and then said, "Hey, we need to figure out what's going on." And so that set things in motion. And again, I give credit where it's due, is that when people, in certain circumstances, people have seen these problems and they've acted. And when they act together and when they take it seriously, they can start to define and to deal with the problem. I'll say that up in the Roanoke area, the Western Virginia Water Authority, which provides drinking water for Roanoke City, parts of the county, and other localities, they found a form of PFAS in their water supply, their reservoir. And there again, they took it seriously. They went to DEQ, the health department. They did sampling and they started to figure it out. And they did find a source. And they also started to increase the treatment of the water that they're serving to their customers so that they could deal with it. So that may have gone beyond the question you asked, but hopefully it answered it.
Great. And the next question is, if PFAS are showing up in drinking water wells, do we have enough data to demonstrate receiving surface waters are likely impaired?
Probably not. We've probably not sampled those two in relation. In fact, in other words, if we have a well that's contaminated, I don't know of places where they've then said, okay, let's go look at these nearby streams. There probably are data like that, but in general, I haven't seen it. Again, though, we can predict that if you have significant amounts of PFAS in a groundwater source, especially in areas of the state like in the valley where you have limestone or karst geology, we know that in many cases that groundwater is also going to be feeding into the surface waters. Those two sources are almost always intricately connected. So whether we have very specific data for specific sites or not, there's no question there are significant problems.
Right. And then our next question is, what do you think about the EPA's recent proposal to remove enforceable limits on Gen X, PFBS, PFHXS, PFNA from the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations?
I, Certainly, I'm disappointed in that. I think that when EPA comes out with those kinds of standards, drinking water standards, there's lots and lots of documentation as to why and how. Uh, why, how those kinds of things are protective or how larger amounts can be a problem. People can quarrel with their scientific conclusions, but that's not what EPA did here. They just said, we're chopping these things, and that's not the way it's supposed to work. And in fact, I would bet that if EPA proposes officially to do away with those drinking water standards, that there will likely be some challenges to that action because you have to explain what you're doing, not just do it because you don't like it.
All right, and we just have two more questions left. The first one is, does Wild Virginia have an official stance on applying sludge to farm fields?
Our official stance is that no activity should be allowed if we haven't monitored it properly and proven that it's not causing violation of water quality standards, contamination of water sources, wells, whatever. At this point, we know that the places where biosolids or sludge is being spread across the countryside, that we don't have those protections. So unless and until we have those protections, we oppose those activities, just like we oppose any discharge that hasn't been properly looked at and dealt with.
All right, and then the last question is, if there is a PFAS fish consumption advisory, should there also be a human swimming advisory? And how much do we consume from occasional swimming?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I will say I'm probably not as as steeped in the science to give a great answer there. I will say that any direct contact, and obviously if you're swimming, you will take in some water now and then. Contact by skin and so on is a concern. I would say that again, the level of exposure, the amount of time that you're in contact with it, the volume of water you might intake, obviously are going to be less than if you're doing a significant amount of drinking water or eating fish. So you would have to surmise that the threats are probably a good bit lower, but that doesn't mean they're acceptable. Um, this is one area of many that we just had to do way more and more study. But I'll say again that getting the data where we know we have the authority to already is a big part of figuring these things out.
All right, and actually one more question came into the chat if you still have time.
Yeah.
Um, it is, what types of assays and methods are used to detect such small concentrations of PFAS?
Well, there are prescribed analytical methods. I won't throw a bunch of numbers at you. There's method 1633 that is one that EPA has recommended for discharges and other sources. There are some others that labs have developed on their own through time to try to get a good handle on these. And there again, we're still doing the science. We're still trying to figure out some of what's best. But we do believe that those methods that EPA and others have recommended are reliable. And I'll just say again that if you go back to the carcinogens or the likely carcinogens, if I'm finding it at all, um, I'm concerned. And so, um, you know, you can always quibble about exactly how much. And I'll say that one sample is a snapshot. It's as simple as that. If I take one sample out of the James River, Chickahominy River, the Roanoke River, I'm getting that little piece, that picture of that little piece. I don't know what's happening there day after day. There has to be some ongoing surveillance there. So, you think we got them all?
Yep, we have no more questions. So,
Okay. Well, it is past 8, so I want to thank everybody for showing up. And again, remember you'll get a follow-up email. Please share this if you thought it was worthwhile. And again, I'll thank Lauren and Kylie for helping me out, trying to keep me on track here. And we'll just say good night for everybody. Thanks so much. All right. See you.